Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of the Hemlane Hustle. Joining me today is Rocky Lalvani, the Profit Answer Man. I'm sure you're wondering, what the heck does that mean? He changes the accounting formula of sales minus expenses equals profit to just flipping expenses and profit, so it's sales minus profits equals expenses. And it's not all about the money at all costs. People come before money. So we'll talk about that as well. Rocky started with nothing when his parents immigrated to the US when he was 2 years old, and his parents were in their 40s. It was his parents' second time starting over in life as they moved here to experience the American dream. In spite of a lot of struggles and his mom passing away when Rocky was only 7 years old, he was able to achieve financial freedom and life successes. Rocky loves to share his journey and inspire others to achieve their dreams even faster. Rocky also has experience with flipping houses and rental properties. He has worked with real estate investors and professionals to help them manage their business and ensure profitability, especially in this day and age when it's much more challenging to cash flow when you are just getting started and interest rates are where they are. Rocky, without further ado, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Excited to be here with you today.
Great. Well, I'm sure that so many of our listeners are really wanting to understand a little bit more about how you got your nickname, the Profit Answer Man. So can you, before we go through your entire journey and background, give us just a little bit more insights into how you got that nickname and what that means to you of putting profits first?
Well, so what I do is profit first. And I was going to launch the podcast. And of course, people don't realize with podcasts, you have to have the right SEO and the right name and the right kind of moniker. And I stole it from a buddy of mine. He's the retirement answer man. And he stole it from a buddy of his who we both know, who's the podcast answer man. And so I was like, you know what? I'm just going to do the simple thing. It works for these two guys. They have massive programs. I'm just going to, adapt it to me and kind of go forward with it. But again, at the end of the day, we help business owners to be more profitable, to have more cash flow. And so it kind of fits in with, it makes it clear what we do and what we're focused on.
I need a story to be able to relate to this. So there's a lot of businesses, especially small businesses. If you've ever started a business, you realize how challenging it is, right, to make it profitable. What are some stories and success stories of this, of a company that wasn't profitable, and how you turned it around and used this formula and your success to basically help them achieve the financial freedom and profits, but more importantly, I think not having stress in their life. Like, it's stressful when you lose money every month.
It is very stressful. So we have a saying, top line is vanity, bottom line is sanity, and cash flow is reality. And in the world of real estate, they use slightly different terminology. How many doors do you have? I don't really care how many doors you have. I care how much cash you take home at the end of the month, right? How much free cash flow do you have after paying for everything and being able to keep it? I've seen the books of people. I can tell you, I know people with hundreds of doors who have no idea how much cash they have and no idea if they're profitable. And many times they're not, because they can't tell me which property is cash flowing positive, which one's negative, and where all their money is going within that whole thing. I work with business owners because, again, it's the same problem, right? They don't look at their financials. They didn't go into business to be an accountant. They went into business to do what they love. So some of you might love finding the deal. Some of you might love the rehab process. Some of you might love some other part of it. But I'm guessing most of you don't love the accounting part of it. It's probably why you're with Hemlane, right? They take care of everything for you, make it simple. And so that's just the reality of it. And so when you just take the time to set targets, to look at the numbers and be able to do that, you see tremendous success. I think one of the early people I worked with, he was an older gentleman and he had a six-figure business. And he's like, look, I want to walk away with $500,000 in a couple of years, retire, and be able to do this. He's like, you think you can help me? And we were able to almost immediately change his focus, how he spent money within the company. And every month he would just look at the total of all his bank accounts and he goes, every month we work together, that number keeps growing up, and it's going up at a multiple of what I'm paying you, a significant multiple. And about, I don't know, 12 or 18 months into it, he came to me, goes, business is really doing well. I want to change my goal to $1 million. And said, you know what? We're actually so far ahead of track, we can do that. And just a little after 3 years, he was able to say, you know what? I'm done. Walk away with $1 million. All the taxes were already paid. Everything was covered. And he enjoyed life. And I've got other business owners where we do the 80-20. We look at their business and go, where's all your profit coming from? And so they can work half as hard and make twice as much, because we don't believe in grinding it out.
Question for you on that.
Mhm.
In order to focus on profits versus, I mean, I'm here in Silicon Valley, so very contradictory about how we operate things here. There's this grow at all costs, which has obviously changed with what's happened with the tech markets and the change in the interest rate climate where capital is no longer free. One of my questions for you on that is, in order to focus on profits, you might risk not growing as quickly, right? You might cut out expenses, marketing expenses, sales expenses. If you think you're operating a real estate business, you might start thinking about, like, if you're looking at rentals, saying, oh, if it's all about just these shorter profits and getting to a certain number, I'm not going to go ahead and chance it and buy this other property that may get a stronger cash flow in the future, but the promise and hope today doesn't look like that. How do you balance that? Like, how would you balance and say to a business owner, don't focus on the revenue, just focus, on the cash you take home?
One of the biggest reasons for failure and bankruptcy in business is excessive growth. And nobody talks about that. Mike wrote that book, Profit First, because he walked away with a lot of money, started investing it in all these businesses, and he essentially went bankrupt through that, right? Because we spend too much money. Bottom line, and so first of all, Silicon Valley has its own way of doing things. They're all trying to be the next Apple. And they don't care if there's 100 failures if one person becomes the next home run, because the odds work in their favor. And that's a problem, because not all of us can raise capital like they can. So if you've got the unique ability to do that, go for it. But there was some guy, I forget who ran WeWork, raised capital for so long, and he blew it all in real estate, right? And this guy who just got convicted running for president, didn't he almost go bankrupt with real estate, at one point?
Yeah.
Dave Ramsey, he didn't get bankrupt with real estate. What happened to Dave is he got so far ahead that the banks looked at his ratios and said, we're calling your loans. And so he was paying his bills, but he got too far ahead of himself. And that's the problem. We don't talk about that, the fact that success can actually take you down.
Yeah. There's so many good in the real estate world today, so many stories of that. I mean, just in tech alone and property management tech where we are, Common went bankrupt yesterday. Common did co-living, right? Property management. They declared bankruptcy yesterday after they raised, I think it was $125 million of capital and went to zero. And it is one of those things that I think everyone should have a finance degree and go to, if you have not done accounting, if you haven't been to school for accounting, you should probably take an accounting course. I don't know how you feel about that, Rocky. But definitely think that there's something to be said to what you're saying, especially now that the tables have turned and money is not as cheap as it used to be.
What I have found is a lot of these startups, when they have a ton of cash, they tend to waste it all. They buy fancy offices, fancy furniture, fancy digs, and they waste it on all this marketing that has no return on what they're doing. And that's what happens. And actually, the other thing they don't do is they don't do accurate cash flow forecasts. So right now, a lot of syndications that were written a couple of years ago are all essentially blowing up because they didn't predict that interest rates were going to go up, although everyone looked around and said interest rates are going to probably go up, and they're not cash flowing. At the same point, you never know what's going to happen. So let's just say you're in an area that's being revitalized and you own a 50-unit apartment building. It's probably like a B unit, right? B class. It's okay, but it's older. Well, what if one of these syndicators comes in and puts a A+ class building up right next to you and says, hey, 1 month rent free and no security deposit? Because they got to fill it, because they got to meet their investor deals, right? And now all of a sudden you're like, wait a minute, nobody wants my building anymore. Or the security deposit thing is what's holding those people up, or there's something. So you have to realize things are going to constantly change. And you know how to solve all problems? Cash.
Yep.
If you don't have any, you're in trouble.
Absolutely.
Right? Warren Buffett's sitting on 150 billion of it. Smartest guy in the world. What are you going to do?
Let's talk a little bit about Warren Buffett. You mentioned Warren Buffett. There's a quote that I love from Warren that's be fearful when others are greedy and be greedy when others are fearful. Nowadays, people are scared to invest in real estate because of interest rates. And when you look at properties on market in a lot of markets, you don't see as much green when you're looking at your pro forma to say, should I invest in this property? What are you seeing? And would you tell listeners out there that they should still be purchasing real estate and rental properties? And how do you kind of think about that versus 2 years ago?
So at the end of the day, it's all about cash flow. If the property can cash flow, great. And if it can, especially if it can cash flow under stress. One of the things I find in the world of real estate is people are very optimistic. Okay. I prefer to be pessimistic. All right. If you think you can get 2,000 in rent, I'd rather say, well, what if we only get 1,800? Can we cash flow at 1,800? Or let's say we're going to do an Airbnb type of a unit and say, oh, it cash flows as an Airbnb. Okay. But if I have to convert it to a rental, will it still cash flow? Because at least then I know I've got that kind of protection. Now, the way I look at it, when interest rates were 3% and we were going into an inflationary environment, that 3% mortgage to me was actually the asset, because you had that low cost. Now, only if you had it locked in for the 20, 30 years. If you've got commercial loans on your properties, which if you're in an LLC, there's a good chance you do, start looking forward what's going to happen. The good news on the other side is I think through COVID, rents went up a lot too. I think rents are peaking, coming down. Again, everything is local and sometimes it's hyper local. So you've got to ask yourself, will it cash flow? Will it cash flow under stress? And then when do I need to rehab it, and what's the rehab going to cost? And we'll talk about that more with Profit First and the importance of having the cash for those types of things too.
You just led to my next question. It's like you're reading my mind, Rocky. I wanted to talk about BRRRR and where the money comes from, and here is why. There's a lot, and this is much more on the flip side that I have seen it. But back when it was the kind of wild west of 3-4 years ago, there were so many flippers that I saw get up on stage and talk about how smart they were because they were buying these properties and putting everything on credit cards. And then obviously the property values were sure to go up because it was part of what was happening in the economy. And they said, and look how much more I can sell it for right after I flip it. And there was not a lot of thought put into it. Like they weren't, increasing square footage or anything like that. And to me, all these strategies were a lot of luck and a lot of risk. And the tables have turned because now I don't see any of those people on stage talking about how smart they are. They are probably hiding under a rock trying to get out of all of the debt they have. So let's talk about that, because with rehabs, all of this stuff you're talking about with rental properties, there's a risk associated with, like, where do you get the capital from for this? Should you be doing it all with cash? Should you be taking out a loan and refinancing, which a lot of people got screwed when they thought that interest rates were at 3% and they suddenly went up so much to 7%. Walk me through how you think about that and what you would tell someone who says, hey, I'm going to buy a property, I'm going to rehab it, then I'm going to rent it out. What would you tell them? Like, where should they get that capital from?
So I think that really depends on the person. Everyone has a different situation. If you're a high income earner, maybe you can cash flow it. Maybe you're somebody with a big, not so much 401k, but an IRA account, and you can do a self-directed IRA. Maybe you're somebody who wants to raise capital by doing sweat equity. So an example of that is, let's say I'm a guy in the trades, right? I know how to fix houses because I'm in the trades, but I don't have the money to buy a house. But what if I make friends with somebody, who's got a high income and say, hey, let's partner on this together. We'll buy it together. I'll do the sweat equity. I'll work with Hemlane and manage the property. I'll do the repairs. You put up the equity and we'll split the profits. That works. There's a whole bunch of different ways, and that's what's so unique about real estate. There's no one right answer, and the right answer today wasn't the right answer 4 years ago, won't be the right answer 4 years from now. So it's constantly shifting. What I'm really much more concerned about with people who get into these burst strategies, especially if they're doing multiples, you have to sit down and figure out cash flow. What I mean by that is, let's say we find a property today, right? I got to put down a deposit on the property today. In 30 days, I need cash to buy the property. So that's a second cash outlay. Then I need to pay for the rehab. Okay. And that's going to take time. And in today's world, supply chains are better, but let's just say that whole process ends up being, 30 days till we close, 60 to 90 days for the rehab, 30 days to rent it. You've got 5 or 6 months there of zero cash flow and money flowing out. How are you going to handle that? How are you going to make the payments in the meantime? If you put a mortgage on it, how are you going to make the mortgage payments until the cash starts flowing? Yep. And so these are all the things that you just have to think through and say, what is the strategy that works for us in this market, in our particular situation? Because depending on where you are, these things are so vastly different. If you're in Silicon Valley, people are like, how can I buy a house and rent it and cash flow it? If you're in Ohio or you're in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, you can buy properties and cash flow them without even blinking an eye at multiples. You just be like, oh my God, I'm minting money here. Now it's getting tougher, but it really depends on your local market. So you've got to sit down and do your math and see your scenarios and see what works best for you. And then how do you make sure you have cash reserves? Because everything goes wrong, right? Things that you didn't expect to happen. And you got to be prepared for that. Like large syndicators always have capital reserves because they never want to make a capital call.
Mhm.
You should be doing the same in your business. Run it the same way. Have the reserves so when it's time to replace the roof, you don't go, oh my God, it's an emergency. The roof. Like, no, the roof was 30 years old. There's no
Yeah.
emergency. You knew it was coming. Everybody knew it was coming. Have the cash ready to do it.
Do you have a formula for how much cash, like what the cash reserve should be on a property? And of course, it completely varies between if it's a single family or a duplex and age of property and all of that. But what would you say if someone were buying a new property or inheriting a property, which we've seen quite a bit of more recently, what should their cash reserves be?
So I think it depends. And first of all, I'm assuming when you bought these properties, you came up with a pro forma and you
Yeah.
said, right? You said my vacancy rate is 5%. And you might have said, hey, 10% should go to capital improvements over time. Well, then start putting 5% of your rent in a vacancy bucket so that when you do have a vacancy, it's not like, honey, we can't pay for the groceries this week because I have to pay the mortgage because we didn't have a tenant. Your vacancy fund actually covers that month's shortfall. And by putting the money aside ahead of time, that 10%, over time, you're going to build up so that when it's time to do the repair, do it. Now, if you're going out and you're buying one of these properties and you rehab part of it and you go, the roof's 25 years old and we're not going to do it today, well, then I would be aggressive about getting that money ready for when that roof is going to come. You can sit down and look at the house and say, hey, appliances go so often. Like I assume appliances are going to last 5 years, depending on your flooring. You know, carpets are 5, 7 years. If you've got vinyl plank, maybe you can go longer. You know, the roof has got a lifespan. You know, the hot water heater and the heat have lifespans. So look at your current systems and you can actually calculate out what you need over time so that the cash starts building and it's always there. So when the time comes to do the repair, you're like, "Ugh, the heat blew out. Well, I got 12 grand in the account. The heat's 5 grand. Write a check and go back to bed and enjoy life."
Yeah. It's interesting. I've seen this with the class of properties that you have and folks who buy properties that look great on paper, but they don't put enough in the reserves. And what I mean by that is I've seen pro formas where like the maintenance and repair cost is like a percentage of rent, but like the rental rate is really low and the amount of maintenance needed on that property is obviously much higher or consistent with a property that may be $2,000 a month in monthly rent versus this one that's at 500 or $800 a monthly rent. How do you think about and go through that?
So if you're at 5 or 800, I'm guessing that's a C class property and it's an older property,
Yep.
right? Yep.
Yep.
So first of all, C class properties, depending on how good you are at tenant screening and making sure you've got a good tenant, because you might be cash flowing phenomenal on a C class property um, up front, but the moment the tenant moves out and it's trashed and they haven't paid uh, rent for 3 months and you have to evict them, all that excess cash flow disappears in the rehab, in the no rent, in the attorney's bills, and then you go negative. And so I think you really need to look at the quality of the earnings and the quality of the type of tenants you're going to have. And if it's an older house and it's not standard types of things, I mean, you can look at the house and go, you know what? That house is going to take a lot of money. You can just
Yeah.
look at it. It's not rocket science, right? You just kind of know what's going to happen. And I think it looks great on paper, but you've got to eyeball. And that's the other thing. I think a lot of people are buying remotely.
Mhm.
You really need to look at, you can't tell in pictures the quality
Yeah.
if you don't have a flavor for the neighborhood.
Yeah.
And then if you don't have a team in place that like when we were flipping houses, even today, if I need a roof, it's on speed dial, a plumber, speed dial, a painter, speed dial. Like I already know who I need to call to get everything done, who's not going to rip me off on what they charge because just like everything else, it gets expensive.
Yeah. No, we definitely we have obviously so many listeners who are out of state remote investors, and they kind of fall into two buckets. One is those who've been out there, really know the area, had a really good real estate agent, and then whether it's our boots on the ground or using their own, have a team in place there. There's other ones who went on some website and saw that there was a property and it looked great on paper, but didn't really know the neighborhood or what they were getting into. So I couldn't agree more. Let's just say, Rocky, that I've just purchased my first rental property.
Scary.
When is the right time to purchase another? We have some investors. I was talking to one the other day who purchased 14 in his first year of investing. Walk me through when you think is the right time to add another property.
So, first off, I think it depends on your experience level. But if you're a brand new investor and you buy 14 properties in 1 year and you made one mistake, now you made 14 mistakes,
Yeah.
right? And that's kind of the key. I think you need to know what you're doing first. You need to screw up a little. You need to understand how tenant screening goes. I mean, that's the big, when you do these things, there's a whole bunch of things involved, right? There's learning how to properly buy a property, right? Then there's the financials of how to cash flow the property. Then there's tenant management, right? And then there's property management in and of itself. Those are all different skills.
Mhm.
And we're all good at some things and we suck at other things, right? It's just life. For me, like tenant management's not my favorite thing. It's the least on my list. And so I'll do anything not to let a tenant leave. Tell you what, I just won't raise rents. Just stay here and leave me alone. And it works, right? But that's my strategy. Everyone's got to figure out what works for them. So I think you need to get comfortable. And the second thing is, I like it when we have a lot of margin. So if you get a great deal, then you've got the extra margin to make mistakes. It's okay. But if
Yep.
you're buying 14 properties, unless you're a millionaire, like it's really easy to blow that all up. It
Yeah.
really is. And so take it slow, learn your lessons. There's a lot of little nuances that you don't get to learn until you get to learn them. And you can learn from others' mistakes. You can learn from your own. I just would, I would ask how well versed were they in what they were doing.
That it's such a good point that if you buy we call them through one rental at a time alligator properties, and you buy one because you did the numbers wrong and now you've bought 14 of them, very quickly that negatively impacts your cash flow. Walk me through interest rate environment and how you think about that. Profit first is obviously looking at the profits, making sure that, to your point, you have good margins on it. But walk me through what you think of the current interest rate environment, or maybe it's like, hey, I still follow the same formula, and now there's just fewer investors out there, even though there's a lot of deals that don't look as great as they used to. There's fewer investors, so you can still make it work with profits. But how do you think about it?
So everyone thought interest rates were going to drop, drop, drop. I mean, at the beginning of this year, oh, the Fed's going to cut rates all the way through the election. Well, that hasn't happened, right? Um, I think there's some serious macroeconomic problems that the Fed has to deal with, and cutting rates is not in their best interest. So I think we're going to be sitting with higher rates for a while. So the question is, if you can cash flow with these rates, wonderful. Like, what's the word? If I buy a house and I can put a 30-year note on it at today's rates and cash flow, one of three things is going to happen 3 years from now. Interest rates are going to drop. Okay, I'll refinance. Woohoo, win.
Yep.
Interest rates are going to stay the same. All right, I'm still cash flowing. Interest rates are going to go up. Well, thank God I bought it when the rates were so low.
Yep.
And so it's a win-win-win as long as you cash flow. But if you're not cash flowing and you're hoping that something's going to change that's going to allow you to cash flow, you better have a lot of excess cash.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Rocky, thank you so much for your time. Anything else that you want to share with listeners today about Profits First, and also how can they reach you?
So, yeah, I mean, there is Profit First, which is the general one. There's also a Profit First for real estate book out there written by David Richter. So it kind of gives you a little bit more specialization on it. You all know the Profit Answer Man podcast. We talk about this all the time. I think we have a couple shows on real estate. But check it out. Listen, if you've got questions, email me. All the stuff's in the podcast.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Rocky, for being on the show today. Really appreciated your time. And hopefully this is a good lesson for everyone to make sure that they're not looking at their top line in the revenue, but they're looking at their bottom line.